This is the story about the time our house was raided for murder. Before we get into the night of the raid, I want to take you through the day that came before it. The little things might seem small, but they matter. They tell a bigger story. I'll walk you through what Sundays looked like in our house, the rhythms, the routines, and roles everyone played. Sit tight and bear with me. It was a Sunday, and like any ordinary Sunday at ours, it was the day we spent a chunk of our mornings and afternoons at church. But before any hymns or sermons, there was Eve. She'd rise with the sun, rattling pans and flooding the house with the sharp, unmistakable scent of seasonings. A loud, almost arrogant aroma of baked chicken that crept into every corner. Sleeping in was a sin, not by God's law but by Eve's. If she was up, we all would be too. Work around the house had to be found, even if your body still desperately clung to sleep. It sounds sweet. A mother up early, cooking for her family before church. But that wasn't it. She had often said a woman's cooking was what kept a man, so as much as I'd like to believe that was the case, it never was. It was all to impress her husband. Her speciality was baked chicken, rice and peas, egg and potato salad, coleslaw, plantain, and mac and cheese with veg on the side. It was our father's favourite, all of it carefully curated to please him. And just like Eve, he was also on a first-name basis once I had left their house, so from now on, we'll call him Robert. Robert wasn't responsible for much around the house. In later years, he made it known that he was the king of the castle, and for the most part, Eve treated him as such. For her, he came before anyone else, just not herself. For a long time I admired Robert, but once the rose-tinted glass shattered as the years went by, finally breaking into what felt like a million pieces. I realized he wasn't the father I desperately wanted to believe he was. He was weak. Where he was once known to be the man who'd defend his children against his wife, he went from that to staying silent, to finally teaming up with her to make our lives a living hell. He once told me, "Well, that's my wife. And at the end of the day, I have to lay down next to her." I'll never forget hearing that. Those words stuck with me. Robert was someone who I looked at as a man of reason, the one parent who we were allowed to give our side of the story to, and he'd listen. So once he had uttered those words, I knew then and there he was no longer choosing the right side. It was now Eve, or us. And he chose Eve. He had waved her his white flag and switched sides completely. Before Eve started cooking, she'd pick out mine, Emma's, and Sarah's dresses. I can't remember what we wore that day, but we nearly always matched, even if we hated the outfits we were in or couldn't walk in the heels she bought. The beatings and her constant reminder of how worthless we were to her would soon change that. She'd pass our clothes to Robert, who'd iron all the outfits, and once he'd finished, would lay them over the banister outside their bedroom for us to collect. Around this time, there were only 5 of us living in the house. Me, Emma, Sarah, and 2 of my brothers. Benjamin, who was the eldest of the 2, and Liam. The others were either at uni or had escaped this hellhole completely. Once our outfits had been chosen for us, she'd make her way downstairs, burst into my brother's room and shout, wake up, don't you see it's time to get ready for church?" Benjamin had a grey suit that was his favourite, his go-to. "Benjamin, don't bother putting on that grey suit like you don't have any clothes. Carry up the black suit for your father to iron." She would ask Liam what suit he planned to wear, and before he could answer, she'd already be looking through the 4 or 5 suits he owned, handing him the one she thought was best. She was a prideful woman, so to outsiders, we were the picture of a respectable, well-dressed family. But it was all a performance. Every pleat in our dress, every curl in our hair, every matching accessory, all of it was for Eve's vanity. Nothing good Eve did was for us. She loved the compliments, lived for them. She'd laugh about how sister whoever's kids never looked half as good as hers, and how they didn't have as much style as she did. It was safe to say that Sunday mornings were even more chaotic than the rest of the week, as we had people to impress. Once Eve finished cooking, she would head back up to her room and prepare herself for church. Eve never wore makeup or anything. She never wore hair extensions as she believed none of these things were godly, so all she had to do was shower, sweep her chemically straightened hair back into her usual ponytail, put on her head-turning outfit, her handbag that matched, slip on her heels and crown herself with one of her many ridiculously massive hats. Despite this, Eve was never on time. She was never on time for anything, no matter how much notice she was given. Robert, on the other hand, was never late for anything. Matter of fact, he was never on time either. He was always early. So of course he was punctual enough to attend Sunday school. We'd get to church and make our way downstairs to the hall where the classes for kids were held, and Robert would continue upstairs to the church for his service. Sunday school started at 11 and lasted an hour, and within that time we'd be taught something from the Bible, and then, for the last 15 minutes, we'd be upstairs sharing what we learned with the other classes before making our way to our seats, waiting for the 12 p.m. service to start. We weren't allowed to go around mingling with other children while they prepared for the main service, and everyone got settled in. We had an image to uphold, and we sure as hell were not allowed to accept anything from anyone because, of course, Eve drilled it into our heads that the church was crawling with jealous witches who were using us to get to our oh-so-holy parents, so it was strictly no accepting sweets, money, or gifts, even from the people she did seem to like because she thought it would make us look like beggars who didn't come from anywhere. She was a typical black mum when it came to these things. My friends said theirs were the same. It was confusing at the time because I can recall instances where someone would offer me money in front of her and, of course, I'd say, "No, thank you, I'm okay." And she'd turn around and tell me, "Take the money. Why are you trying to carry on cute?" And instead of throwing the money away when she had the chance, she'd pocket it. Anyway, Eve would finally arrive, making her grand entrance. She'd be tossing compliments like confetti at the very people she gossiped about over Sunday dinner. She deserved an award for her performance because, from what I remember, not a single soul saw through her. When the final amen sounded, my siblings and I scattered like leaves in the wind. We didn't want to linger, we didn't want to talk. We wanted to escape. Church was only 10 minutes from home, 5 if you walked with purpose, and we always did. Eve and Robert, on the other hand, were in no rush to get home. Why would they be? They floated through the crowd of admirers and worshippers whose judgment was clouded by their outer appearance and the status they held in church. Church would be over by 2:30, but they'd spend almost an hour or so mingling. When they finally came strolling up the road with Brother Charlie, who lived nearby, they'd stop out front and continue their conversation like they hadn't left a house full of hungry children. One of us would brave it, walk outside and ask for the key. "Just wait, I'm coming," Eve would say. But she never came. Not right away. Not after 10 minutes. Not even 20. It didn't matter that we were starving. Once she finally came inside, she made sure to let us know about how we'd embarrassed her in front of Charlie and what would happen if we tried it again. She'd plate up, making sure to share out in the order of who she hated the least. First it was Robert's, the boys', Emma's, Sarah's, then mine. There was definitely a ranking order, and I was nowhere near the top of the list and had no intention of even trying to get there. She knew this, and she hated me even more for it. We were never allowed to eat anywhere other than the kitchen, so most Sundays we were forced to sit around the kitchen table and eat with them both. The conversation was always based around church gossip, from how someone's husband was gay because of how he danced to how Sister whoever was jealous of Eve, or how she thought someone couldn't sing, which was ironic coming from her, because I kid you not, she couldn't hold a single note. The woman was actually talentless. She barely ever had anything nice to say about anyone, and if she did, she would soon change her tune. She was a jealous, bitter woman who believed everyone, even her own daughters, were in competition with her. Most of us didn't want to stick around long listening to the gossip, so, to get away from it, we'd scoff down our dinner so we could quickly exit the kitchen. My sisters and I would rush upstairs to our bedroom to chill. Emma and I would laugh and make up games to play before we drifted off, unaware that a couple hours from now we'd have a rude awakening. And this time, it wasn't Eve. Sarah was in year 8 at the time, so she had outgrown Emma and I as we were still in primary school. Sarah would sit up on her phone texting and living up to her role. She really was the eyes and ears because she'd be the one to spot the 3 bully vans blocking the road entrances onto the square. The 5 or so police cars lined up along the street outside our house. One big black van, and a long line of officers surrounding our front door trailing back out into the street. Some of them dressed and armoured in riot gear. No sirens, no knocks, just murmuring and preparations. The police were getting ready to enter the house, and it was apparent that they hadn't come in peace, nor did they come to reason. It was about 11:30 at night, and the house was silent. Everyone in their rooms. Our bedroom lights were off, so it was dark. The only thing offering any light was the small beam from Sarah's phone. Sarah could hear voices outside, and of course, being the nosy person she was, she peeped through the curtains and saw the setup. She ran next door, tripping over herself, to Robert and Eve's room where they were lying in bed, cuddled up, watching TV, and with an urgent yet loud whisper said, "Mum! Dad! Police are outside!" The commotion of it all woke me up, the fast and heavy footsteps of all 3 of them rushing in and the bedroom door opening and slamming shut. Robert drew the curtains, opened the window wide, and leaned out with Eve just behind him, hanging over his shoulder. Robert called down and asked, "What's going on?" To which an officer, pointing a flashlight in his face, shouted, "Get downstairs now!" And Robert replied he was on his way down to open the door. Robert and Eve ran for the bedroom door. Robert headed downstairs whilst Eve ran back to her bedroom to put a skirt on, Eve telling us to stay where we were. The police had no interest in waiting for anyone to let them in, as by this time you could already hear pounding on the front door from upstairs. They were trying to force entry. Robert and Eve were now downstairs, and it was one hell of a commotion. I could hear shouting, scuffling, and heavy boots rushing up and down the corridor, but I was in 2 minds, as that night. I had wet the bed. I wanted to know why they were here, and why so many of them, but I felt like I had been busted and was in trouble of my own. We didn't grow up in a normal household, so there was no such thing as potty training. We grew up with the type of parents who thought shaming you and beating you was enough. And even then, for some reason, most nights my body just wouldn't wake me up. When they got downstairs, Robert unbolted the locks, then opened what was left of the door, and they rushed in, shouting as they entered. Robert tried talking to them, asking what was going on, but they had no interest in explaining anything to him. They came with motives, and having a conversation wasn't one of them. As I stood over my bed staring at the sheet, I remember Sarah urging me to come downstairs with her, but I was in such a state of confusion as I had been abruptly woken up to a situation I didn't understand, and in an even bigger state of panic that I had soaked my sheets. My mind couldn't process all the additional chaos going on around me and kept going back to trying to hide the fact that I had wet the bed from Eve. Emma had also woken up to the noise, and from her top bunk, peeped through the curtains, seeing for herself what awaited outside. She kept asking Sarah what was going on, as she was the only one talking and was visibly excited. Sarah brushed her off and just said the police were here and continued telling me we should go downstairs to see what was happening. I remember Sarah being annoyed by my lack of response, as she wouldn't have me to hide behind whilst she fed off the spectacle. However, this didn't keep her long from leaving the room anyway. She stood at the top of the stairs listening. Robert, who I had never heard swear, not in English anyway, was telling the police to fuck off and leave us alone as he tried heading back upstairs, and they weren't too happy with that. He was swarmed by officers, hands ripped from the railings, him dragged towards the front of the house, wrestled to the ground, and beaten. Sarah came back into the room, letting in the cries of chaos and the sounds of sorrow every time she opened the door. We could hear him screaming, "Jesus! Jesus!" over and over again until we couldn't hear him anymore. While we could hear Robert crying out for Jesus, at the same time we could hear Eve screaming repeatedly, "You're going to kill him!" The police had ushered Eve outside, and we could now hear her from our bedroom window shouting at the police. Sarah left again, and from what she later told me and Emma, she made it down to the ground floor and was met by officers. Emma and I looked through the window and we saw Eve sat on the floor, barefoot, legs stretched out in front of her, looking up to the sky talking, but we couldn't make out a single word. Emma climbed down from her bed and stood next to me as I stood there, back to being fixated on my bed, and asked me what was happening, and I myself knew as much as she did. I didn't respond in a normal way you would expect someone to who had just seen and heard the commotion happening in the house. So she asked me if I was okay. I said quietly, "Yeah, but I've wet my bed." She replied softly, "Oh, why don't you just change your clothes?" And then it clicked. It was as if she pointed out the obvious that brought me back to the present. So that was what I did. I changed my clothes while Emma pulled my blanket over the bed, covering up the wet sheets. Sarah was the type that thrived off drama, and even more so if she had someone to tag along. It was evident she wasn't concerned that there were officers all over the ground floor progressively making their way upstairs. She came back to get us just as I was changing my skirt, and with a strong annoyance in her voice, almost shouting, said, "What are you lot doing? Taking long. Just come downstairs." We didn't have a reason to go down as we were told to stay where we were, and to be quite honest, the sounds coming from downstairs were terrifying. Emma was annoyed with her tone and snapped back, "We're coming. She was changing her clothes. You just love drama." Sarah hated hearing that because she knew every bit of it was true. We followed her down, and by this time, the police had made it to the second floor and I could hear them in Benji and Liam's room. Cautiously walking downstairs, Sarah just in front, and Emma trailing close enough behind me that I could feel her on my right arm, I saw Liam being led out of his room, downstairs, in handcuffs. Benji was nowhere to be seen and I was worried. He was well known to the police, too well, known by name. They looked for any excuse to arrest him. Even if he didn't do anything, it didn't matter. His name, his face, it was all they needed. This was new. It was just worse this time. We made our way down to the final flight of stairs and it was still kicking off. There were officers standing at the bottom of the stairs telling us to come down, asking if there was anyone else up there. We shook our heads and were led to the kitchen. As we made our way to the kitchen, a man dressed in a suit entered and told the officers to get off of Robert. He seemed angry. You could hear both the panic and authority in his voice, and like dogs trained to react to commands, they did as they were told. He said that he recognized him, that he was the man who spent his Saturdays volunteering in his prison preaching. He helped pick Robert off the ground, face bloodied and bruised, and escorted him into one of the vans. I was scared and confused and could see Emma felt the same way. With the door opened wide, letting in the winter air, we were cold, and Emma, tucked in close to me, was shivering. I picked up a sheet that was piled on top of one of the dining chairs along with other clothes that were pulled from the dryer and wrapped it around us. I remember a female officer saying, "That's right, wrap up and keep each other warm. It's really cold, isn't it?" I could tell she felt sorry for us as we were just children whose lives were being disrupted at no fault of our own. The atmosphere was weird. The shouting had stopped, but there was a lot of chatter. Our kitchen was filled with officers, and with Emma sat on my lap, I looked over to see an officer putting the kettle on, opening the cupboards, helping himself to a cup of tea, like he was making himself at home in the middle of all the mayhem. I can't explain it, but something about that moment got to me. It felt like a violation. It was like none of what was happening mattered to him. And maybe it was small, but it was enough. A reminder that people with power rarely cared about you. Just a quiet way of saying they could do what they wanted, and you can't stop them. Eventually they told us we were going to be taken to one of the vans, so we grabbed our shoes that were sat near the front door and headed outside. Once outside, blue lights now on, we saw Eve still sat there, her head now hung, asking God what she was going to do. I felt sorry for her. As much as I truly believed she was a wicked woman, in that moment I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. It looked as if she'd truly been defeated. We walked over to her, Emma and I sharing the same plea, "Mum, get up. Mum, get up off the floor," as we tried picking her up. She didn't look at us. Instead, she looked up at the sky, dropped her head again and said in a low and hollow voice, "They killed him." By him, she meant Robert. There wasn't much of a reaction from any of us, me, Emma, or Sarah. I don't know whether it was because we couldn't process what she was saying or because it couldn't be true. We'd just seen him. Everything was just happening so fast. There wasn't enough time to think anything through, just enough to register what we saw and to believe that over what we heard. Eve started picking herself up off the ground while we held onto her arms, trying to steady her. As she stood up, an officer asked her where she could find her shoes. As she spoke, I looked back at another officer closing a van door where Benji had been sitting the whole time, and I was relieved to see him. We were escorted to a van on the opposite end of the street, furthest away from the house, and climbed in. Eve sat there sniffing, wiping her runny nose into her blouse, while Emma comforted her. The officer came back with her shoes and asked her if there were any friends or family members we could stay with. Eve said no, but the officer kept asking. Eve, becoming increasingly irritated after every no, snapped. Not expecting a real answer, she asked the officer where she was expecting her to go and why she kept asking when she already said there was nowhere else. The officer said she'd speak to her supervisor, closed the door and walked away. Not long after, Robert was brought over to our van. He sat next to Sarah with a bloodied ball of tissue in hand, dabbing it on the side of his head, and said, "Look what they've done to me." With tinted windows, the van was dark. The street lamps barely cut through the window, casting a faint, muddied light. And even then, you could clearly see the bruises they left on his face. Robert was tall, slim, and dark in complexion, so the fact that you could see how badly he'd been bruised was telling to how much force was used. Robert sat with us for a few short minutes before an officer escorted him to the back of an ambulance and was taken to hospital. The rest of us sat in the van for a while, wondering what was going to happen to us as Eve said she didn't have anywhere to take us. For a moment, I thought we'd be taken into care, and despite all the disgusting things Eve said would happen to us if we went, I'd have preferred if that were the case, at least for myself. That crazy thought didn't last long. One of the officers slid open the van door and said, "We've got somewhere for you to stay." And just like that, we were on our way. I sat there staring out the tinted window, eyes fixed but unfocused, like I was looking straight through the world. Nothing stirred in my mind, just stillness. And then, like someone slammed the volume back on, the van stopped, and the thoughts came flooding in. We'd arrived. I was confused. We hadn't gone far, barely 5 minutes from the house that was now a crime scene. But this estate, I'd never seen it before. From the outside, it almost looked pretty, like a block of mini apartments, gated, though not monitored, and surrounded by garden beds that hid the streets from view. We made our way up the stairs, and that's when the illusion fell apart. The stairwell reeked of urine, and it felt like, at any moment, you might walk past an addict. By the time we reached the door, when escorted by an officer and a man with the keys, it was clear this wasn't an apartment. It was a hostel. Inside was a narrow hallway. To the left was a cramped bathroom. To the right was an even smaller closet-sized toilet. At the end of the short hallway was the rest of it, a room with a double bed on one side and a single on the other. It had a door that opened into a kitchen, basic and bare, a few cupboards, an electric cooker, a small fridge freezer, and a kitchenette for washing up. After the briefest of tours, both men left. We had so many questions that Eve wasn't in the mood to answer, so we were told to go to sleep. Sarah and I shared the single bed, and Emma and Eve shared the double. It was Monday morning, and instead of getting ready for school, Eve and Robert, who had arrived at the hostel while we were asleep, were getting ready to go to the police station to get some information. By now we knew someone had been murdered. They made it clear that we weren't to leave the hostel, we weren't to answer the door, and should anyone ask questions, our only answer should be, "Don't know. Ask my parents." After looking around the kitchen and opening the empty cupboard doors, we went back to the room, sat up in the bed, backs against the wall, facing each other. Emma and I sat across from Sarah talking about what had unfolded the night before, trying to figure out who had been murdered. Sarah did most of the talking. She kept replaying the events like they were a movie she couldn't stop watching. But her tone wasn't fear or concern. It was excitement, glee, like she'd just witnessed the plot twist of the century and couldn't wait to tell everyone. This was nothing but pure entertainment to her. What made it worse was that sometimes I'd look up from my lap and catch her smiling as she spoke. At one point, she claimed that when we went down, an officer had said, "Come downstairs, you black monkeys," but Emma and I questioned her, not because we couldn't believe someone could say something so directly racist, but because we honestly couldn't believe Sarah. She was known to be dishonest and had the tendency to make things up to create a scene or add fuel to the fire. Sarah was the provoking type, the type of person who would make up stories to escalate a situation or to get out of trouble. She was angry that we were questioning her, asking why she'd make it up. We asked her to explain it again, and instead she angrily said, "Didn't you hear him? You lot were there." Emma and I didn't hear a thing. It was strange that we could recall everything else but that. And as a child who was overly aware of her surroundings, this wouldn't be something I'd miss. Despite being irritated at the fact Sarah knew we didn't believe her, this didn't stop her continuing on about that night. Sarah began talking about what happened when she had gone downstairs the first time alone, and suddenly her attitude that night made sense. Why she'd been annoyed when she came back upstairs, and why she was pushing a version of events we couldn't confirm. Sarah didn't like feeling embarrassed, and if she ever did, she'd want to get back at you. As I said, Sarah couldn't fight her battles alone, so she'd try her best to get anyone on her side, even if that meant lying. She was quite the manipulative type. When she went downstairs, the same officer she accused apparently sternly told her to come downstairs. She hated that. With other people present, she felt humiliated, not just because of how he spoke to her, but because she'd been caught out. She knew she hadn't gone down for any reason other than to be nosy, and it backfired. She went on to say that she rolled her eyes, told him to shut up, and went back upstairs. Again, Emma and I didn't believe her, and this time we were not sparing her feelings or keeping quiet to keep the peace. Given the level of chaos, the reason they were there, and the fact that Sarah was a bold-faced liar, it made no sense to believe her. We told her straight, "Now you're just blatantly lying." And that set her off. "Yes, I did. How the hell would you know? Were you there? Just shut up because you lot were scared hiding upstairs." Although Emma was the youngest, she was fiery, and she wasn't having any of it. First of all, no one was hiding upstairs. You just wanted to be fast and go downstairs because you love drama, and now you're just lying because you want to act like you did something, but you didn't do shit. Emma was on go and was ready to go off. She had so much more to say, but being protective over her, and in an effort to calm her down, I chimed in. I explained that it didn't make sense because of how aggressive the officers came in, and they wouldn't have just let her go back upstairs, especially if they're there for a murder. I continued on saying it would have made more sense if she said she was going to get us, but overall, her story just didn't add up. Even more furious and almost shouting, she said, "Yeah, that's what I said. Are you lot deaf?" I said, "Shut up because I need to go back upstairs to get my sisters." Emma and I exchanged looks and we weren't letting up. Her story had already shifted and we weren't letting it slide. We let her know that that was not what she initially said. We called her out, told her she was a liar who would exaggerate the truth even outside of this situation. Sarah knew she couldn't deceive us, so ended the conversation with, "Whatever, man, you lot are dumb." Emma and I were over it. We didn't respond, just exchanged looks. The next few hours were silent and awkward as we were stuck in the same room. Hours had gone by and Robert and Eve were nowhere to be seen, and we were getting hungry. Emma and I still hadn't spoken to Sarah until the topic of hunger came up, and she finally broke the silence saying how hungry she was too. And in the sneaky style of Sarah, she was back at it again, setting me up. Eve had already given a strict warning not to leave the house, and I had no intention of doing so, but Sarah was working on convincing me that I should, because we were all hungry. There was a lot of back and forth about how we were going to find something to eat, and I was adamant that we should just wait for Robert and Eve to get back. But along with Sarah convincing me how quick it would be for me to go and return before they did, I felt sorry for Emma, knowing if I didn't go, we'd be waiting hours for their return. The anxiety of getting lost or even kidnapped was kicking in. I was still in primary school at the time and had never travelled alone, and, having almost been kidnapped once before, something I had never forgotten to this day, I decided I no longer wanted to go. The instructions just weren't clear enough for me to risk it. Unsurprisingly, Emma understood, but Sarah wasn't too happy about it and started her manipulation tactics. "Oh, well, you lot are the ones who are hungry. I'm not even that hungry. I'm just trying to help you two. What don't you get? It's literally up the road." It was so obvious to me at the time. She wanted to make sure it was me and not her. But still, I felt bad, because Emma was hungry too, and I knew Robert and Eve wouldn't be back for ages. Emma and I asked Sarah why she couldn't just go since she knew the route, but she wouldn't budge. She knew what she was up to. Despite being the oldest, she knew she wouldn't be in the firing line if something went wrong. She wasn't the one disobeying Eve's instructions, but she'd still benefit if I did. This might be a good time to mention, being the eldest didn't mean anything in our house. Responsibility didn't fall on age. It fell on favor. And favor wasn't earned. It was decided. Everything was based on how Eve and Robert viewed you individually. So whatever people assumed about eldest sibling duties, that was never the case for us. Anyway, back to the story. The more Sarah spoke, the more it discouraged me from going, because to be honest, she was annoying me. Sarah was the type who would encourage you to do things she was too scared to do herself, or purely for entertainment, knowing the consequences that followed. She was so devious. A short time passed and Emma and I were walking around to pass time, going back and forth to the kitchen, opening cupboards we knew were empty. Every now and then Emma would frustratingly say, "When are they coming back?" And this made me feel bad. I looked at her and asked if she was really hungry. She said she was, but that she didn't think I should be the one to go since I didn't feel comfortable, and Sarah knew how to get there. The plan was to go to our cousins. Being cursed with empathy, I couldn't help but feel really bad for her, so I told her not to worry, that I'd go. I assured her I'd be fine, and that I'd be back quickly. As I was putting on my shoes, Sarah perked up again, asking me if I was going, but I ignored her. I could tell she felt a bit of guilt for not going. She kept repeating the route despite me giving her no response, but now she was making it sound simpler than she did before. It was a whole bunch of, all you have to do is this and that, but it just confused me even more. Emma and Sarah stood out looking over the balcony, and I was already at my first hurdle. I had no idea how to get out of the courtyard. Every exit I took led me to another yard leading to a different set of flats, but I soon figured it out, and after going through 2 other yards to get to the exit, I was on my way. I was scared. Once I got out, nothing looked familiar. I spent a lot of time walking back down the same street as each one seemed to lead to a back road. The plan was to get on a main road where the buses went down. I remember fighting back tears that emerged from fear and frustration. Eventually I found it. I heard buses and followed the sound, praying for familiarity. It was a very long road and I walked it for about 15 minutes, and not a single thing about it gave any indication I was headed in the right direction. I picked up the pace knowing if I wasn't going the right way I'd have to turn back. After what felt like forever, I saw it, somewhere I recognized. A wave of relief crashed over me. I was home, or near it at least. But the square was no longer ours. Blue and white tape cornered it off. Police everywhere. I felt like an intruder. One of the neighbors, the local gossip, saw me. "Psst," she said, gesturing for me to come over. "What's going on?" I shook my head. "I don't know. They're saying someone's been murdered. Again. I don't know." I continued past her and approached an officer, telling him I needed to get to one of the flats. He lifted the tape and let me through. I walked across the square, only glancing over at our house. I rang the buzzer and my aunt picked up. She asked me if everything was okay, and I remember hearing my cousin shouting in the background, "Oh my gosh, let her in, let her in." My aunt opened the door and asked again what was going on. I told her I didn't know much, just that someone had been murdered. Who it was, why they thought it was us. I had no answers. My cousin rushed out of her room, tying the band of her robe around her waist mid-run, almost barging my aunt out the way, and gave me the tightest hug. In that moment, it was the first time in what felt like a long time. I felt safe. It wasn't just warmth. It was grounding. The kind of embrace that reminded you you were real and alive and still human, even if everything else felt like a blur. I didn't realize how much I'd needed it until her arms wrapped around me and held me like she wasn't letting go. Come in, she said, pulling me to the living room where all three of us sat down. Even though she asked the same question my aunt did, the way she asked felt more like it came from a place of concern. She asked questions like how I got there, where Robert and Eve were, and how everyone was. I shared everything I knew with them, which wasn't much, to be honest. The only thing I really had answers to was what went on the night the police showed up. She explained the flashing lights through her window caught her attention, so she ran to tell her mum, and by the time they came back, they saw Sarah, Emma and I standing outside. She said she told my aunt she was going down to get us, but she stopped her, told her she didn't know what was going on. You could hear the frustration bubbling as she spoke, but there was something else too. This flicker of regret. She looked down for a moment, almost as if she was speaking to herself. I should have come anyway. Then the words just spilled out of her fast and heated, about how angry she felt watching the police stroll in and out of our house, sipping tea from our mugs like it was just another day for them, and that she wanted to go down and say something. You could tell it had been sitting on her chest, festering. And then, mid-rant, she stopped, like the thought had just smacked her in the middle of everything. Have you eaten? Not yet, I said quietly. She jumped up and said, What? Mummy, they've not even eaten. Half talking to herself in disbelief as to how anyone was letting this happen. She rubbed my arm and said, Don't worry, Meddy. I'm going to pack some stuff for you to take back, okay? For a moment her anger was silent, the kind of focused rage that fueled her movements. My aunt just sighed and leaned back into the sofa, still watching me like I might fall apart if she blinked. I don't remember everything she asked, just that she seemed more interested in what I knew rather than how I felt. I remember hearing my cousin shouting from the kitchen, asking how we could not have been fed yet. By then, my aunt could tell she was furious, so she went in the kitchen to help her. I sat on the sofa looking at the TV but not really paying much attention to it. They came back with a bag of food for me to take back. We talked a little longer, then I left. The front door creaked open, and in stepped Eve, followed by Robert, still battered, his temple a swollen mess of purple and red. They didn't say anything at first, just walked in, glanced around like they were counting heads. The room shifted. It was subtle, a tightening of the air, a quiet that buzzed beneath your skin. They hadn't brought food, not even news, just themselves, tired, drawn, clipped at the edges like they'd barely survived a storm. Eve didn't ask where the food had come from, but she noticed the bags. Her eyes lingered on the biscuit packets spread across the bed, and I saw it, that flicker of suspicion, the kind that always seemed to simmer just beneath her surface. Who told you to leave the house? Her voice was low, unsettlingly calm, her question not directed to anyone specific. No one answered. Emma just looked down, chewing slower. Sarah leaned back like she wasn't a part of it. And me? I froze, waiting for the heat to rise, waiting for her to explode. But she didn't. Instead, she sat down on the edge of the bed, pulled off her shoes and said, Next time, wait. Then silence again. The rest of the day bled into itself, a blurry mess of whispered conversations as we just laid there, listening to the buzz of the fridge, the occasional sound of traffic, and the ever-present hum of uncertainty. Morning came, but the light that crept through the blinds didn't feel like a new day. It felt the same tight room, the same stale air, the same unspoken dread hanging over everything like fog. And the rules were clear. No questions, no answers, no noise. Eve and Robert left early again, said they were heading to the police station to find out what was happening with Benji and Liam. They repeated the same instructions before leaving. Don't leave, don't open the door, don't speak to anyone. If anyone asks, say, I don't know. Ask my parents. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, silence filled the room. A different kind of silence, heavier, more suffocating. The cupboards were still empty. We drifted back into the bedroom. Emma and I climbed onto one bed, Sarah flopped onto the other. We stared at the wall for a while before anyone spoke. I wonder who died, Sarah said casually, as if we were discussing a movie plot. It's got to be serious. You saw how they came in. Her tone still had that undercurrent, that strange excitement, the thrill she got from recounting every messy detail as if it were hers to narrate. It wasn't concern, it was performance. Emma and I didn't respond. Not at first. Sarah went on, retelling everything she supposedly saw, this time adding new details. Exaggerated, embellished, inserted just to spark a reaction. Then came the lie. Again. I'm telling you, that officer said, "Come downstairs, you black monkeys." He shouted it right at me. Emma rolled her eyes. You didn't say that yesterday. I did. You lot just weren't listening. I turned my head slowly, not buying it. You said you told him to shut up and went back upstairs. Well, yeah, I did. But he said that first. You're lying, Emma snapped. You always lie. Sarah bristled. What would I lie for? You think I want this to be happening. Yes, we both said. Almost in sync. Because she did. Not the situation itself, not necessarily the violence, not the arrests, but the attention. The role she got to play in the center of it all. She wasn't scared. She was energized. So, he apparently said that before you told him to shut up, but yesterday you said we were there. What? I said, pointing out the discrepancy. Sarah lashed out, called us dumb, said we were scared little girls hiding upstairs while she was the one downstairs doing something. But the more she spoke, the more it unraveled. We challenged her. We called out every contradiction, every version of the story that changed from one telling to the next, and for once she couldn't twist her way out of it. She shut down. The silence returned. Not peace, but tension. A cold war of side eyes and silent resentment in a room too small to contain it. Time dragged. Eventually the subject shifted. The hunger returned. And with it, a problem. There was still no food. Emma's stomach growled, and I felt that sharp ache of guilt twist in my gut again. She didn't complain. Not really. She just sat quietly, glancing toward the door now and then, like she was waiting for Eve and Robert to walk in with bags of groceries. But we knew better. Sarah, sensing her moment, leaned in. We should go get food. I already knew what she was doing. She wasn't going. She wanted me to go. You know where our cousin lives, I said. It's just down the road, she replied, evasive. You know how to get there now. I didn't. Not really. The route she had given me before had barely made sense, a string of complicated directions, and the day before I had only found it through sheer luck after getting lost so many times. But she kept pushing, manipulating, masking it as a suggestion, a favor, even concern. Emma, ever sweet and quiet, looked at me with sad and tired eyes. I knew what she wasn't saying, and despite every red flag waving in my brain, despite the anxiety twisting my stomach into knots, I felt that pull again, that curse of being the one who always did. So I said I'd go. Again. I slipped on my shoes slowly, half hoping something would stop me. A knock on the door, Eve's voice calling up the stairs, a sudden change of heart from Sarah. But none of that came. She just stood there, arms folded, spitting directions like a sat-nav programmed to mislead. Her tone had changed, all urgent helpfulness now, like she wasn't the one sending me out into unfamiliar streets again. You'll be fine. Just follow the road till you see the corner shop, then cut through the alley, and you'll see the park. From there, it's straight. And my response to all her noise was, just shut up. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my jacket, the courtyard still a maze. But I remembered now. Turn left, through 2 more courtyards, past the open broken gate, out onto the road, just like I did the day before. This time I moved quicker. I didn't stop, eyes darting across doorways and alleyways like something might jump out at me. My legs were heavy with dread, but my hands clutched the memory of Emma's face, that soft, tired look that kept me going. I rang the buzzer, and my aunt answered again, her voice lighter this time, like she'd been waiting for me. Come in, baby. I stepped into warmth, familiarity, safety. My cousin was already in the hallway, arms open like she'd known I'd be back. "You made it," she said, wrapping me in another hug. "You hungry?" I nodded, and she didn't hesitate, straight to the kitchen. She didn't scold or probe, she just packed. Like she'd been preparing for this moment. Snacks, juice, and other bits that would last, along with board games to keep us occupied. "You got it?" she asked as she handed them over before letting go. I nodded. "Go straight back. Don't stop. And if anyone asks you anything—" "I don't know, ask my parents," I said, finishing it for her. She nodded once, proud and sad all at once. I left with the bags knocking against my legs, the weight of them strange and reassuring. I made it back to the hostel without stopping, my mind replaying every step. When I got to the courtyard, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was tired. Not the kind of tired you sleep off, the kind that seeps into your bones. When I opened the door, Emma lit up. She ran over, grabbing one of the bags, thanking me without saying the words. Sarah looked smug, but even that couldn't ruin the moment. There wasn't much to mark the passage of time in that place. No routine, no structure, just long hours of waiting, for news, for footsteps, for something to change. Eve and Robert came and went. Their faces said more than their mouths ever did. Tired, edged, quiet. They were holding something back, and we were all too used to reading between the lines to miss it. No one had been released. Benji and Liam were still in custody. Every day Eve came back a little more frayed, her voice shorter, her silences longer, and when they did speak, it was whispers, coded. One night, after hours of pacing, she started whispering to Robert while she thought we were asleep. I couldn't hear all of it, just fragments. If they don't charge them, how long are they expecting us to stay here? Bring shame on the family. She was scared. That much was clear. But not for us. Eve wasn't worried about what had happened to her children. She was worried about what would happen because of them. To her reputation, her story, her control. That was when something shifted in me. I stopped waiting for her to act like a mother. I stopped hoping she'd choose us. And that small shift, that quiet internal break, was more powerful than any of her words. Even after all she'd done, this was the first time I didn't feel like her child anymore. It was sometime midweek when the news came. Not all at once, not in the way you'd expect. No official statement, no clear answers. Just fragments, whispers between Robert and Eve when they returned from the police station. They walked in quietly. She didn't speak to us. Instead, she shut the door behind her and immediately started preparing food. Her way of reclaiming control, of grounding herself in the ordinary. But Robert, he lingered. He stood near the door like he didn't know whether to come in fully or leave again. "They're holding them. Benji and Liam," he said finally, his voice low. We waited. There had to be more. "They're not giving details, but it's serious. That was all we got." No one asked what serious meant. We didn't have to. It had been written all over the faces of the police that night, in the force they used, in the way they'd taken Liam in cuffs and swarmed Benji's room like they were hunting an animal. Still, Eve said nothing. She brought Robert his tea, called us for hours, sat down beside him, and started talking about church, who'd asked after them, who hadn't, who might be spreading rumours already. I remember thinking, she doesn't want to deal with this. She wants to redirect it, rewrite it, reframe it. But the truth was sitting in the room with us, and none of us could unsee it anymore. Our spotless family name was tarnished. Across the room, Sarah had fallen asleep, her phone still glowing faintly in her lap. She hadn't talked much since Emma had called her out. My thoughts kept circling the same point. If Benji didn't do it, who did? And if he did, what now? Benji was complicated. Loud, charismatic, reckless, sure. But not evil. He was the one who gave me lunch money for my school trips when I felt too embarrassed taking Sunday dinner. He was the one who took the blame for a sister scared of getting into trouble after breaking something. He was our shield, our big brother, even when he was off doing whatever it was he didn't talk about. I didn't want to believe he could be part of something like this. But I'd seen the way the police looked at our house, like it was a known territory, a name already circled in their files. The longer we stayed in that hostel, the smaller it seemed to get. The walls weren't shrinking, but we were, folding in on ourselves, saying less, feeling more. We were being forced into roles we hadn't chosen, but ones we now wore like second skin. The worst part was not knowing what was happening with Benji and Liam, not knowing when we'd be able to return home, and not knowing what Eve and Robert were hiding behind their stiff backs and short answers. That silence was loudest when they weren't there. They left early each morning and came back late, too tired to lie convincingly, too stubborn to admit the truth. In their absence, we floated in our own orbits. Emma stuck close to me. Sarah mostly kept to herself, licking her wounds, pretending she wasn't. I remember standing up and walking to the window, not to look at anything, just to stand, to feel something different than the weight pressing down on the room, on my chest. Benji? Murder? I couldn't connect them. Not the Benji who danced in the kitchen, who played music loud when he thought no one was home, who defended us when Eve went too far. But now he was the boy in the mugshot, the name in the report, another statistic in a system that already hated us. And all I could think was, how did we get here? Eve didn't cry, at least not where we could see. She just doubled down, controlling the little she could. Who sat where, who touched what, who answered the door, when we could open the fridge, who got what portion, and Robert, he just sat in silence, like a man living in a memory of a house that had already burned down. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we could all feel it. The family wasn't just cracking, it was breaking. We were watching the glue melt, the old lies, the old roles, the hierarchy, the fear, all of it slipping through the cracks. The only thing holding us together now was the silence, and even that was starting to give way. It unraveled. Eve slammed a cupboard door hard enough to make the plates inside rattle. She was mad that the family image she'd worked so hard to create was falling apart, and she couldn't stop it. Then one morning, just like that, they told us we could leave. No ceremony, no big speech, just a bag, a ride, and a line about how things were sorted for now. As the car pulled away from the hostel, none of us looked back. There was nothing to see. The street looked the same when we got there, but it felt wrong, still, almost staged, like nothing had moved since the night we were taken. As soon as the door opened, it was like the house was speaking. Not whispering, showing, look at me, look what they did, look what you let happen. It didn't feel angry, it felt wounded, like it was showing us its wounds one room at a time. Food had been pulled from cupboards and scattered across the counters. Dishes we hadn't used were stacked high in the sink. Clothes from the washing machine were spilled across the floor like someone had gone looking for something and gave up halfway. Furniture had been shifted, some of it broken, and when I got to our room, I froze. The window still open, the same one Robert had leaned out of that night. Cold air spilled in like the moment never ended, like it just happened. Everything from my wardrobe had been dumped in a pile on my bed. All I could think was, I didn't want them sitting in it, so I started clearing the pile, grabbing armfuls and tossing them onto the floor. And then I saw it. My blanket had been pulled back. Underneath, still there, sour, soaked, the same sheets I'd tried to hide that night. That detail broke something in me, not loudly, not even visibly, just a quiet crack. The kind you didn't notice until you're already falling through it. I don't remember what Eve said when she saw the state of her kitchen or the living room. I just remember how she looked at it. Eyes wide, mouth parted, a flicker of disbelief that twisted into something sharper. She slapped her hands against her thighs like punctuation, then straightened her back. Voice low, tight, controlled. Don't say anything in case they've bugged the house. As far-fetched as it seems now, at the time, it sounded possible. The damage wasn't in the walls. It was in us. Later that evening, the house phone rang. Eve answered. Then, almost screaming in disbelief, shouted, "What? What are you saying? It cannot be." Her mouth wide open, her head flung back behind her shoulders, then dropped into her hands. The phone call wasn't long, and I can't recall everything she said during it, but I remember the moment it ended. She raised her hand, flung her head back again, both pointed to the ceiling and said, "God." She blinked profusely, like she was doing everything she could to fight back tears. I knew it was serious. She'd only ever do that exact thing when something was serious. Then her hand dropped to her sides, and she slowly turned to Robert. It was Angela. Robert's body froze in place, eyes wide, only his mouth moved. What did she say? "They killed Michael." Eve staggered like the floor had shifted beneath her. "What are you saying?" Robert said. I didn't move. I just stared at Robert, waiting for something, anything that would make it untrue, but his voice came fast, too fast, like his body hadn't caught up to the words. "What are you saying? It can't be Michael they killed." The name hung there. Michael, Angela's husband, our neighbour, Naya's dad, the father of Emma's best friend, our family friend, the man who was woven into our lives, our weekends, our school runs, our street, and now he was gone. Everything in the room slowed. The heaviness returned. But it sat heavier this time, like it had grown while it was away. We didn't cry straight away. We just sat still. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be. Michael. Michael was safe, familiar, family even. He was always around. They lived right next door. Naya stayed with us on weekends sometimes when her parents worked. Benji took her and Emma to school. Now he was gone. And all we could think about was them. Angela, Naya, all the pain they were feeling. When we returned to school, nothing felt normal. Miss Campbell pulled Emma and me out of class often, said she wanted to make sure we were okay. But it didn't feel like that. Just felt like she was trying to dig for information. And the irony was, Miss Campbell was one of the people we were specifically told not to speak to, known to gossip. And to be honest, we didn't want to talk anyway. We didn't want to relive it. We were hurting, but forced to carry on like normal. In the days that followed, Liam was released. They had no evidence to hold him, but Benji was still being kept, still under suspicion. We didn't know what they were doing or what they were looking for. Then one day, something shifted. Someone came forward, said they'd seen what happened, told the police who really did it. And just like that, it was over. Benji was released. He came in quiet. Eve and Robert asked him a couple of questions. Nothing heavy, but he cut it short, said he was going to bed, and they let him. That's how we knew the news about Michael had gotten to him. Benji wasn't the type to cry or raise his voice. Even when he should have been angry, he stayed still. Quiet. Like he'd taught himself not to feel out loud. But when something really shook him, he didn't want to talk. He wanted to disappear. To be alone. Sleep for him was the closest thing to escape. I understood that because for me it was too. We didn't press him after that. Didn't ask what they did or what they said. We just let him go. But you could feel it, the weight he carried back with him. The truth came out, and thank God it did. But it didn't erase what came before it. The raid still happened. Benji and Liam spent days locked up. The fear had done its damage. And Michael was still gone. His family's world had been torn apart. We couldn't stop thinking about them. Angela, Naya, what they must have been feeling, what they'd woken up to the next morning, what they'd lost. He didn't deserve it. He was kind, wise, never failed to offer advice when he saw you, about school, about people, about life. We said that to each other a lot, how unfair it was, how it didn't make sense. Emma kept saying the same thing over and over. I can't believe it. I can't believe they killed Naya's dad. She didn't cry. The shock wouldn't let her. She just sat there, stunned, kept asking how Naya must be feeling. Poor Naya, she'd say. And again, like her mind was stuck on it, trying to process something too big for words. We were all still carrying it, the weight of what had happened. Something in us changed. Something in all of us had stayed behind. In that van, in that hostel, in that silence, and on the end of a phone call. Written by Meddy.